Good morning, everybody. Sunday morning here. I'm going to adjust the camera up a little bit. Jeff Morton here. I have been for the last couple of weeks revisiting Frederick Douglass. He was an American orator. He held high governmental position. He had a newspaper in my hometown of Rochester, New York. He was an incredible human being and accomplished a whole lot. I've been reading a lot of his letters. He had 3 autobiographies. I've been reading several of those. They're easily found on the internet. And it occurred to me while I was doing all of this that he was alive at the time of my great-great-great-grandfather. I got a picture of him. Let's see if you can see this. This is George Wilson. George Wilson was, that's a picture of my little brother who passed away recently. Many of you know about that. But George Wilson was a prominent farmer in Honeoye, New York. We still have the property. Part of the property is still in the family, as well as the house that he lived in. He had initially he had 99 acres around the lake in Honeoye. Eventually, it was sold off. There were tax issues and whatnot. And the family sold off quite a bit of the land, but he farmed that 99 acres and was instrumental in the prosperity of Honeoye. He actually was the farmer that provided most of the crops for the community. They actually named a little community after him, and he's well regarded in the state of New York in that particular area. Not widely known, but he was an amazing man. This article was written about his life and who he was in 1945. So he was the father of my mother's father's mother. Her name was Georgette Wilson. No, Georgia Wilson. And he was her father. Georgia Wilson gave birth to my grandfather, who was the father of my mother. Okay, having said all of that, I've been researching a lot of the history of the abolitionist movement, which really began around 1830 in the churches predominantly in the northern states and predominantly New York State, as a matter of fact. But my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, he was stolen by a white dude, threw him on a train, and he ended up in upstate New York. But he was stolen from his family and from the plantation that he was on while they were watching the funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln. There's a lady, a researcher in upstate New York, who contacted me a couple of years ago. She was doing an article on my great-great-great-grandfather, and she was able to trace his life all the way back to the plantation. But I think he was 12 years old, and he was stolen, put on a train, and he ended up in upstate New York, and eventually ended up in Honeoye, New York. There's a lake in Honeoye. There's Honeoye Falls, and then there's Honeoye Lake. I get the two of them confused. Anyway, George Wilson was alive at the time of Frederick Douglass. Now, as a child, I studied, I think I was probably about 12, 13 years old. I ended up in Harriet Tubman's home in Auburn, New York, and I saw her little house at the time. It was a historical registered home now. She had a picture, and underneath the picture it said Black Moses, and I wrote about that in my book. But I remembered Black Moses, and I remembered the little bit of history that the school system taught us about her. Phenomenal woman. So through that process of revisiting her, I started revisiting Frederick Douglass, and I did a whole bunch of research on him as a child, high school maybe. Found out who he was. Found out that his name was not always Douglass, it was Bailey, Frederick Washington Bailey. He ended up in my hometown. I remember riding my bicycle to his grave site, to find his grave site in Mount Hope Cemetery, Rochester, New York, which wasn't very far from where I grew up. The University of Rochester, I found an article here last night. They're actually going to honor him with a doctorate. Now, the University of Rochester is where I grew up. There was our neighborhood, then there was a little tiny strip of woods or forest which led down to the Genesee River. And we used to play around in the forest all the time because it was in our neighborhood. But there was a river, the Genesee River, that went through the forest. Directly on the other side of the river was the University of Rochester. So as a kid, we used to go over there all the time. As a kid, we used to go over there and get in trouble all the time. Let me put it that way. But that's how close I grew up to Rochester, the University of Rochester. So I was real glad to see that they're honoring him today, Frederick Douglass Jr. They're honoring him today with an honorary doctorate, the first one that the school has ever given, posthumously. So that was kind of cool. But it was also interesting to me that while I'm researching this and looking at this over the last couple of weeks, I made a couple of parallels. But to see that, they're recognizing him and giving him a posthumous doctorate, I thought was fitting. The man was an incredible human being. I know where the newspaper that he started, I know the building in Rochester, New York. I remember going to his home. He actually had 2 homes in Rochester, New York. I visited one of them. I didn't know about the second one until recently. But he was an incredible human being. He had a white father. He doesn't know who his father was. And when he escaped out of Maryland, I think. He was 20 years old. And he ended up in New York where a gentleman by the name of David Ruggles, another black individual who was fighting for the emancipation and freedom for slaves. In the context of what they were fighting for was freedom. They weren't necessarily fighting about racial discrimination, but rather liberty and justice for the indentured black person. It was a different kind of mindset, and most of them were conservative, most of them were Republican. In fact, it would have been considered blasphemy to be a part of the Democrat Party back in the 1800s, because the Democrat Party fought tooth and nail to keep slavery in place. In fact, most of New York back in that time was more of a conservative place, if you will, as opposed to what it is today. It's funny how that always happens. But in researching the abolitionist movement and also Frederick Douglass, I begin to see some parallels in how these various committees and organizations and ground floor really, I'm thinking of the word, these organizations sprung up in the churches for the most part. To fight against the injustice and the inhumanity of slavery. The country was never slavery-based. It was never a slave-based nation. However, you had pockets similar to today. You have organizations fighting, for example, the LGBT community and the homosexual community, right to marriage, and all this stuff. You had all of those we have those organizations today fighting for that stuff. Now, I don't want to compare them, trust me, I don't want to compare them to the abolishment of slavery, but it was organizations similar in the abolitionist movement that started springing up from the 1830s forward all over the country, because most of the country was not for the slave trade. And particularly the North, and in particularly California, when everything started moving west, slavery was an abhorrent thing. So there was many people fighting, and we have this mindset that all black people were in chains, and that's not true. David Ruggles was a doctor. He was a doctor in New York City. Frederick Douglass himself, an escaped slave, he became educated and he became a newspaper printer, a publisher. So we have this concept that all the black people were in chains and we were marching along. And no, that's not how it was. In fact, in the state of Albany, you had several black people who were prominent. Captain Samuel Schuler, for example, he was a boat captain. He's famous and well regarded in the history of Albany, New York, and I did some research on him. He had 11 children, but he wasn't connected to the Schuler family, which was the largest plantation in Albany. Yes, you had slaves here too in Albany and upstate New York, but for the most part, the slave trade was more about economics than it was about people. And so as long as you could look at a slave and consider him a farm animal or a laborer, you didn't have to consider him a human being. And that was the attitude. Well, in the churches, that attitude was fought vehemently by a lot of people, not particularly the Southern Church. Those crazy folks down there, they held on to the tradition that black people were animals, and they were to be treated as animals. And that's where you had the hell of the Democrat Party, and it's just a nightmare. There's the problem is most black folks in my generation here today, and certainly the millennials, have no history. They have no concept of this. They only know what's been taught to them, which is really skewed, because most of the school systems in this country favor revised history. In other words, you're not taught the truth. You're taught stupid. And that's what stupid seems to be the prevailing thought. They want to indoctrinate you into the way they think, as opposed to you learning about history and finding out for yourself what actually happened. But in my study of Frederick Douglass Jr., I began to see parallels with the so-called Torah-based Christian movement. And, I was kind of appreciative of the fact that you had these pockets of people, there were factions all over the country that were fighting against the slave trade. And they were vilified, and they were pushed down by the powers that were in control of the government, namely the Democrat Party, which is, folks, the Democrat Party was evil, and in my opinion still is. But they fought tooth and nail against all of these organizations. You had several organizations. You had the New York Vigilante Committee. These were committees that when a slave was freed and made his or her way to New York through the Underground Railroad, you would have slave hunters that would come up and try to find the slaves that escaped from a certain plantation. Well, then you had, after the emancipation, you had lawyers, and you had black lawyers, lots of them, fighting against the extradition of slaves once they were freed. Once they were escaped, they were no longer considered property, and they had a right to freedom. And so you had all these organizations that were literally going to court, fighting for the slave trade, or fighting for the freedom of a particular slave so that it was not carted back off. And these organizations would find jobs for you, they would put you to work, and these were predominantly white organizations supported primarily, and a lot of Jewish organizations that helped out. But for the most part, they would find black leadership, and then they would help them to help the slaves. The history is full and rich with information about that. So they would protect the slaves, and that's how David Ruggles met Frederick Douglass. His name was Frederick Bailey at the time, and he fought for him, on behalf of him. He died in 1845, I believe. David Ruggles did. He had some diseases, but some issues. But he became a prominent doctor doing a particular therapy in New York. But he fought for the case of Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass won his freedom as a result of David Ruggles fighting for that, for the purposes of keeping him free so that he didn't get shipped back to Maryland, where he escaped from. So as I'm reading and studying all this stuff, I'm seeing this handful of people, the abolitionists, fight, non-stop fight for the dignity and justice that the American black or the slave deserved. The history of in our country is full of these organizations. I've got several of them listed here. But anyway, my focus was on Frederick Douglass. I remember as a kid, I got on my bicycle and I rode up to Mount Hope Cemetery trying to find his grave. I couldn't find it. It's a big cemetery. So I finally asked somebody, and they led me to his grave. Now he's got this real nice grave thing, headstone there, but that wasn't the case when I found his grave years ago. And I just, for me, folks, these people lived and died so that I could be standing here making this video. They fought for the dignity and justice that we all deserve. They fought against the slave trade. They fought tooth and nail with their lives the hell of slavery and the slave trade and the Democrat Party. So I can't get on board with the folks like Jesse Jackson and Reverend Al Sharpton and Maxine Waters, because those people freed my mind. Frederick Douglass, David Ruggles, Nat Turner, they freed my mind from living as though I'm still oppressed. Racism exists in every community. It's not just a black thing. Bigotry exists in every community. It's not just a black thing. Anti-Semitism exists in every community. It's not just a black thing. So those people fought all of that. And so I stand here as a product of their lives. Uncoloring Race is all about getting out of a racial mindset and realizing that we have value, and we're people. You know, you have black people in the highest forms of government. You have black people in every, for people to say this is a racist nation is just stupid. It's just stupid. And it dishonors the folks like Harriet Tubman, Mary Beatrice, what's her name? Mary Bethune McLeod, Harriet Tubman. I could go down the list of all of these conservative folks who fought against the Democrat Party in order for change to happen. I just appreciate the history, and I appreciate studying the history so that I can learn the truth, not the one that was forced on us in the public school system. So folks, I'm making this little video to say that there's some parallels between what they were fighting for and what many of us who have left the Western theological Christianity, so to speak, and gone back and started looking at the Hebraic, ancient Near East theological reality of the biblical story, and we're finding so much more than what we were taught in Western theology. And I just think it's amazing that there's groups of people, pockets of people all over this country who are going back and unpackaging what Constantine threw out of the church experience in this country 1800 years ago. We're going back and we're undoing some of the lies that we've inherited. I think of Jeremiah 16:19 as like my banner on this whole thing, because we're going back and we're saying, oh, no, that's not the way it was, and no, this isn't how it was. Even the Catholic Church has admitted they changed the Sabbath. So we're going back and we're digging into the Hebraic reality of the Bible, and we're finding out that 98% of what is actually being told in the Bible is not taught in the churches. So for those of you who are fighting that fight and that battle, you know, hang in there, because people like Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver, God, there's so many, I can't think of all the names of the people who fought against the status quo, so to speak, in the political arena, and also in many of the Southern churches. You have to fight a battle. So I encourage you to fight a battle. But anyway, Bradley Boyster, I don't know if I'm doing it right. Sorry, Bradley. I came across a little short 4-minute video about Frederick Douglass Jr. that he put together several years ago. I contacted him, and he said, sure. I asked if I could use it, and he said, sure. But he said, if you send me one of your books. So I sent him one of my books a couple of days ago, and this is a 4-minute clip. It's kind of a fun little video that he put together about the life of Frederick Douglass in my hometown of Rochester, New York. So bless you guys. Have a great Sunday, and I hope you enjoy the video and the information that I'm trying to bring forward. Okay? Have a good afternoon, a good day. Bye-bye.
My first stop is on the northwest corner of Robinson Drive and South Ave in Rochester. The significance of this spot is that this is where Frederick Douglass's first house in Rochester used to be. The reason that it's not here anymore is because of arson. Nobody knew what happened or who did it or anything. Anyway, years later, they built a school here, and to the left of the picture, they have a sign with plenty of information on Frederick Douglass's life. My next stop is here, on Hamilton Street in downtown Rochester. In 2003, local historians researched and discovered that this house was once owned by Frederick Douglass. This house was not known to have been lived in by Frederick Douglass for well over a century. For 3 years now, this home has officially been a local landmark. Here on East Main Street in downtown Rochester is the Talman Building. From 1847 through 1863, Frederick Douglass published nationally significant anti-slavery newspapers from an office here. The original paper was called the North Star. The name came from when escaped slaves would follow the North Star to freedom. Frederick Douglass was first introduced to the thought that inspired the North Star after subscribing to The Liberator, a weekly newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison. Over time, as he becomes more famous, and as the paper becomes well known, the newspaper becomes titled Frederick Douglass Paper, and then becoming Douglass Monthly. Here in beautiful Highland Park is the statue of Frederick Douglass. This statue was the first of an African American in the United States. This monument of Frederick Douglass was dedicated by Theodore Roosevelt, who was governor of New York State in 1899. The original location was near the railroad station, but due to the fact that smoke and congestion became heavy, city authorities moved it here in 1941. Also, on the side of the statue, there are 3 quotes from important speeches by Frederick Douglass. My next stop is here, where Frederick Douglass is buried, in Mount Hope Cemetery. Frederick Douglass wanted to be buried here because he felt like he made the biggest impact while he was here in Rochester, New York. When my dad and I stopped for a tour here, this is one of my favorite spots to visit. The reason being is because he has 2 different stones. One of the stones says that he was born in 1818, and one of the stones says that he was born in 1817. The reason they had 2 different dates is because he never knew when he was actually born. He never knew when he was actually born is because the slave owners never really cared about the slaves, so they never wrote down when his birthday was. This has always affected Frederick Douglass because he never even knew how old he was. Another unique thing about here is that this is exactly where the slaves would run through when they were escaping on the Underground Railroad. If you look around here, right here is where they would run.